Aaron, I've wanted to cover this topic for a long time. We talk about happy retirees. We do research around divorce. One of the things we've written about is that everybody gets a divorce mulligan. It doesn't lead to lower levels of happiness. Totally fine to get divorced. And now when you get into 2 and 3 and 4 divorces, then there's usually a bigger issue. But divorce is okay. The question though around divorce, and I have many, many friends that have gone through long divorces, brutal divorces. It almost always comes back. It always comes back to the 2 huge things, which are kids' custody and of course money. And when I got married, Lynn and I had almost no money, and I didn't even think about a prenuptial agreement. If I were getting married again today, I would be thinking about it. I absolutely would be thinking about it. And I think that it's a misunderstood. You usually hear about big celebrity divorce, the billionaire. Did they have a prenup? Oh, he has a prenup, but the prenup didn't work. So-and-so still going to get. So I wanted to go right to the source. And this is, you are the prenup guy. In fact, don't you actually run prenups.com, don't you? Did you start that?
Yes, I'm the founder of prenups.com.
How long ago did you get that URL or that web address?
Oh, I acquired it. I paid for it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay. It wasn't like, $7.99 on, okay. Yeah, it was like, you had to bid for it.
I wish. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an amazing web address, but this is also your sweet spot and your specialty. So let's just start out of the gate for our listeners. Give us the most basic, understandable version of what a prenup is and what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Thanks for starting with that. I mean, it is such a misunderstood concept. And, a prenup is essentially a set of rules for how your money and other things are going to be dealt with, both during the marriage and in the event of a divorce. And I think that just that simple definition alone surprises some people, because most people think a prenup is just a plan for divorce. It only comes into play.
Whoa, during. Explain that.
Yeah. So
during the marriage, what's an example of that?
Right. So, when you get a prenup, and first of all, I like to say everybody's got a prenup. You've either drafted your own prenup and decided on the terms, the financial terms for your marriage and what happens if you split, or you are accepting, by virtue of getting married, the default prenup for the state where you happen to live. So it's just a set of rules about how your money is going to be treated. And so, for a prenup, first of all, let's talk about, during the marriage, right? Mm-hmm. So for a prenup to be enforceable, both spouses have to disclose all of their assets and debts to the other spouse.
So it's a big, let's open up the kimono, open up the table.
Right. And just that act of due diligence, that act of full disclosure alone can be monumental for so many couples, because, as you know, a lot of people are married and have no idea about the finances, on the other side of the aisle. And so you can write into your prenup, how your finances are going to be handled during the marriage itself, who's responsible for what bills, who owns what. So, if you come in with a rental property, are the expenses associated with that property paid from a joint account? Are they paid from a separate account? Do you have to cover that with money that you brought into the marriage? If you sell that property, is that something that is that money that is split? If you own a business and your business gets sued, are you responsible for that? Who pays the taxes, when your business gets hit with? And so these are all things that happen during the marriage itself. So before you even get divorced, a prenup can help you deal with, the most common financial issues that come up.
Full disclosure is the key right out of the gate. And legally, let me ask this question: does a couple, and again, I want to ask the question about somebody who may not have a ton of money, but what we think of when we think prenuptial agreements, we think of a couple that gets together and one or both sides, they have a lot of money, they have a business, they already have a bunch of assets. When you go through the process, do you have to legally disclose everything, or is it just that's best practice that you want to disclose everything?
No, you actually have to disclose everything for the agreement to be legally enforceable. In fact, probably the most common ways that a prenup gets thrown out and doesn't get enforced at the end of the day is because somebody didn't disclose fully their assets and debts coming in. And so because
that can essentially render it null and void.
Right. That can render it null and void, because by getting a prenup, you are trading the default prenup, or the rules, the rights, and responsibilities that you would have under the laws of the state where you happen to live. You're trading that for this new set of rules that you and your future spouse have come up with. And in order to make a knowledgeable decision on that trade, you have to know what you are potentially giving up an interest in. And to do that, you've got to know all of the assets and debts on your side and all the assets and debts on the other side. So it's not just best practices, it's mandatory.
It's part of the law to make it enforceable. All right, then it leads me to this. Hi, everyone, and I promise we'll get right back to the video. But in full disclosure, I'm affiliated with Capital Investment Advisors, which is a full-service, fee-only financial planning and investment management firm located right in Atlanta and Tampa and Denver and Phoenix, or wherever you are. And if you'd like to take your retirement planning or retire sooner journey to the next level, Capital Investment Advisors would love to help. You can find our team and schedule a time to chat right at yourwealth.com. That's yourwealth.com, or just click the link below. And again, this is a national audience, so it's depending on what state you're listening in, your state laws are going to govern this slightly differently or maybe very differently. But here in the state of Georgia, would you say our set of first of all, I'd like to know, as an example, what are they in Georgia? Essentially, what are they in Georgia? And is Georgia a similar state to a lot of other states, or is it way off the mark?
Georgia is a little bit of an outlier state in some regards. Now, there are some similarities across the board. So there are 41 states that are considered equitable division states. And then there are 9 states that are considered community property states. And in community property states, pretty much everything you accumulate over the course of the marriage is going to be split 50-50. Almost no questions asked, kind of no fault type of jurisdictions, no matter what.
The community property states, and again, California is one of those.
California is one of those. Texas, yeah.
California, Texas. And so really, in those states, if you're married for 20 years, you start with 0, you end up with $1 billion. No matter what either party does,
right?
Affairs, no affairs, good, bad, indifferent. Hey, I just want to walk away. It doesn't matter. It's going to, the assets are typically, to your point here, typically just pretty much divided equally.
Yes. Yeah. There's obviously some exceptions to the rule, but yeah, that's the general idea. Whereas in equitable division jurisdictions like Georgia, the court is authorized to divide your marital estate equitably, but that doesn't necessarily mean equally.
Wow. Okay. So what's an example? So give me an example of how it could be couple A, it's equal. Couple B, I guess it ends up not being. Well, how does it end up being divergent from that?
Yeah. So probably the most common example is some kind of financial malfeasance, right? So if I'm married and my spouse and I, both accumulate, $500,000 in retirement assets, and then I take all of my money and I go out and I gamble it on penny stocks and I end up with 0. I'm probably not getting half of her retirement account at the end of the day. The court's probably going to give me less money, right? Or if I, had a paramour, if my wife is listening, if I had a paramour, and I paid for her car or her apartment, I'm probably going to pay some kind of financial penalty when it comes down to dividing our marital estate.
And who decides that? Is that is a judge, or so judge is the ultimate arbiter, or a mediator?
It's typically going to be a judge. A mediator doesn't have the authority to make kind of like a final determination on how things are going to be divided. But it comes down to a judge. And in most states, especially in Georgia, there is a lot of discretion left up to whoever that person is. Whatever courtroom your case gets randomly assigned to can have a monumental impact on the ultimate division of your marital estate if you get divorced in Georgia.
Okay, so here in the state of Georgia, and it sounds like these other 41 states, just because you've been married a long time does not mean assets get divided equally, because the word equal and equitable is there's a difference between the two.
There's an important difference, and different judges have different opinions. I've gone to some of these like legal conferences, and judges sit on the panel, and there'll be one judge that says, "Oh yeah, if somebody cheated, if there was infidelity, that spouse is getting less of the marital estate," and then the judge right next to them will say, "Look, you were married 30 years, you amassed $10 million, you have an affair, you're not getting $1 million less dollars just because, you had an affair. Affairs happen all the time." This is, some judges' opinion on it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people see kind of like the fidelity issue as separate from the financial issue. And so depending on the judge, depending on the courtroom, depending what county you happen to live in, what state, what area, maybe what the judge had for breakfast that morning.
Wow.
There's a lot of uncertainty in what could happen to your finances if your marriage comes to an end.
How divergent have you seen it be? Maybe a more extreme case. In an extreme case, a couple ends up with $10 million, they get divorced. What's the most unequal you've ever seen something like that?
Usually when there is some kind of, very serious misconduct. So the penny stock example I gave you didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah,
I did have a case where, the parties were married for, probably 35 years, and the husband had been the breadwinner for the household that entire time. The wife kind of never asked what was going on with the finances. She just assumed everything was fine. They lived in a big, nice house on a nice piece of property, and she never really knew what was going on until at the end of the marriage. She started complaining about the finances and her spending, and as it turned out, he had basically taken their entire nest egg and
gambled it away. So instead of saying, okay, you've got $2 million house, everybody gets $1 million, it wasn't $1 million each.
Right. She got probably more like 80% of what they had left.
So malfeasance, really financial malfeasance, right, ends up can sway the decision of the judge. And again, another judge, to your point, could have said, well, no, it's still 50-50.
Right. There are some judges out there who would say, you had a responsibility to ask and to stay up on everything. And if you didn't participate in the financial decisions, maybe he made some wrong decisions, but you didn't try to sway him away from that. So, it really is up in the air. And financial malfeasance is really just kind of the most common, but
poor money management.
Poor money management, infidelity can make decisions. Some judges consider who earned more money during the marriage. Many judges do not, but some judges, and everyone, these judges are human too. They all come with their own, kind of preconceptions and ideas about what is fair, what is equitable. And some judges believe if you were the one that earned most of the money, then you should walk away with most of the money.
I have so many questions. Length of time. What considers a marriage fully baked? Is it a day? Legally married, or do you have to get to a certain amount of years where in a state like Georgia or California, where that's community property, when does it become community property? Or even just getting to the point of equitable?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, I tend to believe in what I would call kind of the first paycheck rule. So in other words, very quickly, because the general rule, and I think a lot of people know this, some don't, but a lot of people know that if you get married, whether you've got kind of a written prenup or not, you're supposed to keep what you brought in and you divide what you accumulate together. That's kind of the general idea of separate property is what you bring in, marital property is what you accumulate together. In practice, it's super difficult to abide by that, abide by that rule, because as soon as you get it, you come into a marriage, let's say you've got a condo, you've got your own car, you got a 401k, you got a brokerage account, you got a checking account. And you get that first paycheck, a little bit of that is going to go to pay the mortgage on the condo. A little bit of that money is going to go to pay your car note, to your retirement account, to your checking account, to your savings account, maybe another place. And that paycheck that you earn, that first paycheck that you receive after the date that you're married, is considered marital money. It's marital property. And so by paying off some of the bills or putting money in these different buckets or different accounts, you have now commingled your separate property with marital property.
And in general, in practice, let's use your condo example. You come into the marriage and your condo is worth $500,000. And 15 years later, you get divorced and it's $1.5 million. Is the $1 million in appreciation, is that then split? Or is it how would that typically work?
Well, it's debatable, and that's why us lawyers have jobs, right?
Yeah.
Because you can, if you have something that is your separate property that you brought in and appreciates just due to market forces, you are supposed to reap all of the benefits of that market forces appreciation. So if you got a condo, it was fully paid off, you didn't touch it, you didn't renovate it.
It just appreciated.
It just appreciated, then you were supposed to keep all of that increase. In reality, that rarely ever happens. You're going to do some improvements. You're going to put some money into it. You're going to pay down the mortgage. And so there are financial experts. There are forensic accountants who, each spouse will get their own, and they'll come up with a spreadsheet that shows how much of the appreciation they want to argue is due just to the market forces and how much is due to, the actions that the parties took over the course of the marriage. So again, if you do not kind of set these things and, set your own set of rules in a written document on your own, it's up to, a lot of guesswork and ultimately the decision of a judge as to what is marital and what's separate, who gets what.
So it's not so much about length of time. It is more about when you start commingling. So let's say you're a retired couple and you both come into the marriage and one person has 1 million, one person has 10 million, then let's say they get divorced 10 years later in a typical state, each would continue to have, and let's say you're not really sharing a paycheck. Does that make things easier? If you're, let's say, a retired couple and you're not earning and contributing?
Yeah, it does. It makes it a lot easier. If you are just drawing down on accounts that existed prior to the marriage, then you're not commingling. You're not taking new money that is earned during the marriage, marital money, and dumping into your separate property accounts. There would be relatively easy to kind of keep everything separate. But I find that it is rare that it is ever that clean.
It's never that clean. Okay. Let me go to a tabloid scenario here. I think back over the last 30 years, I think of the tabloids. It's the Playboy bunny marries the super old guy. Right. And everyone says, oh, well, she's just obviously marrying for the money, and let's say that he lives and they get divorced. Is what happens typically to that tabloid scenario? Does the Playboy bunny get a whole bunch of money or not necessarily in a typical state, even if there's, let's say, no prenup? And what you're telling me is probably they don't necessarily get a whole lot.
Well, I'm going to give you the typical lawyer answer, which is it depends.
Sure, it depends.
It depends. In those situations, they're probably going to get something. They're probably going to get something.
And why though? What is the equitable part of that? Because they were married and assets accumulated. How does that happen?
A big part of it is going to be the accumulation of assets during the marriage. And so a lot of people say, well, he had the business before they got married, but he's still earning money from that business during the marriage itself. And the default of that money is going to be that it's marital.
Right. Okay.
I mean, he could try to argue that it's just market forces, but the kind of default position is that a paycheck, a dividend, the money that is coming in, if you want to prove that something is your separate property, it's your burden to prove that it's your separate property. The presumption is that it's marital. So all of the money that, that old rich guy got, during the marriage is going to be considered marital. And, if nothing else, the litigation dragging on is worth some kind of payment to him.
Right.
In reality,
that can be $1 million. That can be $1 million bill right there. Litigation.
Right. The litigation bill can be $1 million. I've worked on a case myself here in the state of Georgia where our client paid over $1 million in fees on his own.
Just for legal
fees. And I think that's like one of the underrated benefits of a prenup. Most people think about a prenup as protecting the assets that you're bringing into the relationship. But it is also insurance against the divorce case itself. Actual litigation. That can be
very real money.
That can be very real money. The average divorce case takes, on average, over 12 months. In COVID days, it's more like 18 months. And the average cost of a divorce is $15,000 per spouse in a contested divorce. And that's just the average. So as I would tell my clients, that means about half of the people are paying more than that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can get, astronomical. And the more money that you have when you are going through a divorce, the tendency is the more expensive that divorce case is going to be, because the more there is to fight over. And so the cost of a divorce and, hence the need for a prenup is not so much a function of what you have coming into the marriage. It's what you have going out.
How much time do you as an attorney spend on the prenup side relative to the divorce side? Well, let me ask you, you are a divorce attorney, correct?
Yes, until just recently. I've now specialized in prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, but I've done, over the past 16 years, I've done
many divorces.
1,000 divorces.
Is there any sort of truth? This conversation it's almost as though makes me think that there's this urban legend that as, I'm going to make sure you get a pit bull attorney. I want a really tough attorney. Make sure you're well represented so you can, you're not treated unfairly. But what you're telling me is, to some extent, it doesn't necessarily come down to the attorney so much. Does it not come down more to the forensic accountants and the judge and the law, as opposed to, is there a big difference? I mean, again, now that you're out of the business.
Oh yeah. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, the attorney does make a big difference.
It does.
And like you said, everyone believes they want a pit bull attorney, but to a pit bull, everything looks like a steak, And so, there are attorneys who all they know how to do is fight. And so they're going to run up a bill. The case is going to take longer. They're going to take, a very aggressive approach, which can be important. You want your attorney to have the ability to at least turn that on and off, an aggressive approach. But sometimes a softer approach can be better for the client. Right.
Really, it sounds like a great negotiator could end up really being the best choice, as opposed to the proverbial attorney pit bull.
Right. There's two ways that your case ends. One is by settlement and one is by trial, and 90% are going to be settlement. Mm-hmm. So if you're just going by the odds, you want somebody that's going to be a good negotiator and get you to the finish line without spending a significant percentage of your net worth on legal costs.
All right. So let's go back to then. I also wanted to ask about kids in custody, but maybe let's start with the cost. In general, what would it cost to do a prenup? And I guess it would be a fairly wide range. Yeah,
a fairly wide range. But for your average middle-class couple, they can expect to pay probably a few grand for a prenup. And that's maybe per attorney, because most people are going to want to have, their own independent representation, and, have somebody look at it and advocate for, give them ideas of things they might want to ask for on their side.
Okay.
If
so it's not a huge expense if it's a relatively simple.
Right.
Let's say you come in and you've got a 50-year-old business owner or two different business owners and lots of different assets. That can get, I would think, more complicated.
Yeah, it can get more complicated. We've done some for, professional athletes where it gets into, tens of thousands of dollars. But regardless, it's going to be a tiny fraction of whatever that same couple would pay, in the event their marriage doesn't work out.
And I think about then, let's go back to the human side of this and the kind of the uncomfortability of getting married, and you bring up an athlete as a great example, getting married, huge earner, to bringing that conversation up, right? We're in love. Well, let's get married. Wait a minute. Let's talk money, right? That is clearly I would think that's the number one reason people don't get prenups, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to know, I wonder what the percentage of people that even do get prenups. I mean, is it a pretty high percentage the older you get? Or is it still pretty rare for people to even do it?
Interestingly, the percentages of couples that have prenups goes up as you go younger. Because I believe what you just said, the stigma associated with prenups is so deep and goes back so far. There was a study done probably 25, 30 years ago that said between 3 and 5% of marrying couples get prenups. And then there was a study commissioned just this past year where they interviewed people who were kind of marrying age, and 40% of them said that they would be open to the idea of getting a prenup.
No wonder you bought prenups.com. from 3 to 5% to now 40% of people are getting prenuptials, prenups.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple things in play here. One is the people who are getting married today grew up in kind of the peak divorce rate of the 80s. People think that the divorce rate is still 50%. It's not. It's probably closer to 40. But, that number of 50% of marriages end in divorce came from the 1980s. And so the kids or, kind of the millennial generation who saw their parents go through, these divorces are saying.
It was the heyday of divorce.
It was the heyday of divorce.
Well, by the way, why is that? What changed, do you think?
A big part of it was the advent of no-fault divorces that started in California, I think in 1969. Former Governor Ronald Reagan signed it into law as a way because at that time you had to prove that somebody was at fault. And so when couples just didn't get along, one spouse, usually the husband, would have to go to court and say, oh, yeah, cruel treatment and, I did this, that, and the other wrong, just so that the couple could get divorced. Otherwise, if you didn't prove significant enough fault on the part of one spouse or the other, the court could actually deny the divorce case, even when both sides wanted it.
So when that went away, when we went to no-fault divorce, that really spiked rates.
That spiked rates. I think also, women being in the workforce and having more earning power, more independence. I think the stigma of being divorced going down over time also contributed to it. In my opinion, there were probably just as many people in unhappy marriages that wanted out of their marriages. Yeah. But the societal factors kind of prevented them from doing so.
However, you think it's come down, though, a little bit. So we've gone from around 50 to around 40. And what do you think is lowered the divorce rate?
Yeah, and I think that brings up the other factor, which is, the average couple who gets married today is getting married significantly later in life.
So you're a little more of a match. There's a little more thought when you get married at 35 versus 22.
Right. And, I think that, a good comparison is looking at, the 1960s, marriage to today. So in the 1960s, a couple that got married, their average age around that time was about 22. They typically had no equity, either spouse, in a house.
Zero money, age 22.
401ks hadn't really been invented yet. Credit cards had kind of just come out, but they were very rare. Student loans weren't anything like they are today. You could work your way through school, an idea that is kind of foreign today. Right. That couple would usually have maybe 0 to 1 bank accounts. Like I said, no retirement account. It was a very simple marital estate. They were starting absolutely from scratch. Whereas the average couple getting married today, their average age is about 29. Doesn't seem like that much older, but that average couple is likely one or both spouses has some equity in a piece of property. They each have 1 to 2 retirement accounts. They probably got 4 or 5 bank accounts each. They've got 3 or 4 credit cards each. They've got their own vehicles. One of them may have a business. And so that couple getting married in the 1960s, I would liken it to like a startup business company. You're starting in your garage from absolute scratch, right? Whereas the average couple who gets married today, it's like a merger of 2 already formed corporations.
Yeah, that's
and
so true.
You would never do something like that without a written plan of like, what is this going to look like? How is this going to work? And so I think a lot of the younger generation, and maybe most importantly, these couples getting married today, they've got 10 years of baked in financial habits that they've built up on their own since they moved out of their parents' house. And so they look at, just this way more increased complexity combined with the lowered stigma of the prenup. And I think that accounts for a lot of the explosion in interest.
Okay, so and the lowering divorce rates, which makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to that stigma, so you're saying the average couple today, it's fascinating that the younger the age, the higher the rate of prenups. Is it still an uncomfortable conversation? I guess I would think for more and more families that are in their early 30s, it's not. Hey, we should probably get a prenup. Okay, honey, let's get a prenup. But there's got to be a big percentage where it is a uncomfortable conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. There are some where it's like getting life insurance or getting a will. But for a lot, probably the majority of couples, it is a difficult conversation. And, interestingly, and maybe a little bit, unintuitively, the way to go about it is not to go to your honey, to your sweetheart and say, hey, I want a prenup.
Yeah, how do we approach this? What do we do? What do our listeners do if they're on the verge of marriage or they're thinking about their kids getting married? I want to go talk to my kids and make sure that my son or my daughter gets a prenup. How is the best way to approach it?
What I've found is that people don't really object to the component parts of a prenup. What they object to is the word prenup or the idea of a prenup itself, right? So if you go to your significant other and you say, hey, should we be transparent with each other about all of our assets and debts that we're coming into the marriage with? I mean, you certainly wouldn't want to be surprised if I've got, 20 grand of credit card debt or 50 grand of IRS debt, and you don't find that out until we're, applying to purchase a house, right? Would you agree that we should, lay down some rules about spending? That we should have a deep conversation about how we're going to set up our accounts and have some kind of agreement about what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours. Can we set up these different, I call them money buckets, and determine what's going to be in my bucket, what's going to be in your bucket, what's going to be in the joint bucket? How are we going to fund the joint account? Is our checks going to go into that joint account and then we each get, an allowance from that joint account? Or are we going to keep our money going in our separate accounts and we each kind of pay our share of the bills? Is that share of the bills going to be 50-50 or is it going to be pro rata with our incomes?
Yeah.
Should we have ongoing mandatory disclosures of important financial information like our incomes and our savings rates and our retirement? All things that we typically advise clients to put into their prenuptial agreements. And then, yes, like any good partnership agreement, if this were a business, you're going to also, in addition to having kind of the rules of the road or how we're going to manage this partnership, you would also have, the safety net, the contingency clauses for what happens if this partnership doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And when you approach it from, hey, I'm trying to plan for our marriage together, not I'm trying to plan for our divorce.
So really, it's branding, right? So to some extent, instead of calling it the estate tax, changing it to the death tax makes it sound even worse. So here, prenup in the stigma of the name and the word prenup does sound uncomfortable, but really all it is all the things that we probably want to do in an appropriate, sensible union anyway, which is transparency. Hey, do you want to be transparent? Of course. Do you want to have some rules around spending? Yeah, of course. Should we talk about mine, yours, ours? Yeah, of course. Okay, then let's go see Aaron.
Yeah. Let's commit this to writing.
Well, another question: don't couples get their own separate prenup attorney, or do they ever come and do it together?
So lawyers can only represent one side of the transaction. What I have found is, and in most states, probably 45 out of the 50, is not actually legally required that both spouses have their own attorneys. So a lot of people will have these conversations on their own, get educated about what can be included in their prenup, and then go hire a lawyer to draft up the documents. It's not your typical, it's not like litigation where it's adversarial. This process ideally should be cooperative, collaborative as a process. So a lawyer can only represent one party. They can only give legal advice to one party. Most people are going to say, if you have any doubt whatsoever, go ahead and get a lawyer on each side of the equation.
Wait, so are you saying somebody can do a prenup without a lawyer?
Yeah, people can do prenups. Well, I wouldn't recommend that they do them on their own.
Yeah.
But a lot of people will have one lawyer draft up the documents and then, the couple discusses what they want in the document by itself. I think most people, certainly if you're talking about if there's any kind of significant assets or there's any kind of complexity, a lot of people get a prenup that literally says, if we split up, we're splitting everything 50-50.
Okay.
No questions asked.
No questions
right?
asked. Okay.
Or, I have this inheritance from my parents. This is going to be set on the side and everything else. We split 50-50. Or I have this business. I'll be responsible for the business debts. I'll be responsible for, I'll own the assets of the business. But everything else, we split 50-50. And so a lot of those kind of couples, we were doing something very straightforward and simple like that. may not need to spend, the money to go get, separate attorneys.
But you still, so then you have attorney friends and colleagues where you'll say, oh, I need 2 lawyers on this, and hey, go talk to this lawyer. And so these are cordial communications and documents. So sometimes you do need somebody on each side.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Often you need to.
Have you ever seen a prenup start okay and then spin out of control and lead to some bigger financial issues with a couple or relationship issues?
Yes. Yeah.
Ooh.
I mean, I think, it depends on your motivations, for a prenup. If you are trying to get some clarity for your relationship, if you are trying to, avoid a messy, expensive divorce in the future, but you plan on being very fair in the interim, then you're less likely to have problems. But if what you're trying to do is punish the other party, or leave them penniless if things don't work out, then that's probably going to come out in the process of you preparing, your prenuptial agreement. And so, I've also, had somebody, come to me in the past and say, I need to get a prenup because, I can't have her, getting, her hands on, my assets.
Sure.
And then I explain, this due diligence, this full disclosure requirement. And he says, there's no way I could let her know what I have.
Oh.
And my advice was, are you sure you want to go through with getting married? Are you ready to make,
Have you seen some people back away from marriage once they start the process?
I have my suspicions. I may not be privy to the final determinations that they make. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that some people, once they find out the meaning of what marriage means for your finances, that they think twice about it. I mean,
sure.
In today's day and age, we think about marriage as mainly a romantic relationship, a romantic kind of, joining together of our lives and creating a family. But as I like to say, marriage is the most important financial contract that you'll ever sign in your life.
It is.
It's just most people haven't read it.
Yeah. and really reading it goes back to your particular state, right? If you don't have a prenuptial agreement, you're going to have one from whatever your state determines. 9 of the states are community property, 41 are equitable, which doesn't mean equal.
Right.
And it's going to be left up to some judge who, it really depends on what he had for breakfast that day or what he feels is, quote, equitable, which doesn't mean equal.
Or fair. Right. And you don't know what happened in the judge's divorce, potentially. So they may have their own ideas of what's fair and what's not. And even, amongst the equitable division states and the community property states, there are all kinds of other little intricacies in the state's laws that can inform whether or not, how important it is for you to get a prenup. For example, Georgia is one of 2 states where you can actually have a jury trial for your divorce.
Whoa.
Bring in 12
so it's not just a
strangers.
judge.
Right. It's not just a judge. And so you can imagine if you live in a small town in Georgia, where these people are all going to know you, they go to church with you, your kids go to school together, and they're going to sit there, and all of the things that would normally be irrelevant in any other kind of litigation in an open courtroom
becomes super relevant.
Is exactly what's relevant. The list of what's relevant to a Georgia divorce is a mile long, and the last number in the statute is, and anything else that the judge finds relevant. So people will get up there and talk about their personal lives and what happens in their bedrooms and, people's drinking habits or, whatever, how they behave at home. And this is all in open court. I mean, you can imagine the pressure this puts on people who go through this kind of litigation. I mean, it's one of the, for a lot of people, it's one of the most devastating things that they go through in their lives, not just financially, but, emotionally and social implications.
Yeah, it is. It's a terrible year for so many people. So many of the families that I've worked with that have gone through it and friends, it really is. It's a terrible year or more that they go through in unraveling everything, which leads me to this is custody. Is there anything that can be put in about custody? Do you recommend that, or is that off the table and it's really only about the finances?
Yeah. You cannot address anything that has to do with custody or child support in your prenuptial agreement. There are essentially...
even if you're bringing kids into the marriage, right? Even if you have existing children.
Right. If you're bringing kids into the marriage, then custody won't be in play because unless your new spouse adopts the children that you had prior to the marriage, then they don't have any custodial rights typically after the divorce. But, there's essentially 4 elements to any divorce. There's equitable division, there's alimony, there's child custody, and there's child support. You can address equitable division and alimony. You cannot address custody and child support. So what we'll typically do is, because my goal is to try to keep my clients as far away from a courtroom as humanly possible. And so usually what we'll do is we'll put in, a certain number of steps that they have to go through before they get to the courtroom. So like a very common one is before anybody can file for divorce, you got to go do 6 counseling sessions. And sometimes that takes the form of we're going to try to actually save the marriage. We're going to work on the marriage.
In the prenup. This can be there.
In the prenup itself. In my wife and I, in our prenup, we have a rule that says either one of us can trigger 3 counseling provisions once per year throughout the entire marriage. So we have kind of that power because a lot of times what I've seen is there's a debate, when one spouse wants to go to counseling, the other one's not interested, and then that one comes around, and the first one has already given up on the idea. So we set a rule at the beginning of our marriage. If either one of us wants to go to counseling, we're going to counseling. And we're doing 3 sessions.
However, what happens if one of you says, no, I'm still not going?
Well, then at least you know that the person that you're married to is not willing to live up to the terms of what they agreed to at the beginning of the relationship. I think a lot of it is going in with the correct expectations, right? Like, what do you agree to be fair? It's kind of the same thing. We'll build in kind of like these annual disclosures. I call them the shareholder meeting.
Yeah.
So once a year, at a minimum, you got to sit down and you got to update your spouse on, what the debts are and what your income is, and let's take a look back at the previous year and let's do some planning for the upcoming year when we literally have a checklist of things that we suggest couples look at.
Yeah, so it's a prenup really almost gives you a framework or a scaffolding to prompt couples to have the conversations that they should be having financially no matter what anyway.
No matter what anyway.
It's really, you could argue that a prenup is good for your finances, not just good for your marriage, but good for your retirement planning.
Yeah, absolutely.
You really can.
Absolutely, because there are so many, like the couple that I was talking about where, one spouse had no idea that, over a course of several years that their nest egg was being frittered away by her husband. That's something that can't happen as easily if there is, periodically a light shine.
Every 6-month check-in,
Every
right?
6 months, there's a check-in. And if you kind of build in, transparency and communication into your prenup. So like another clause that my wife and I have in our prenup is neither one of us can spend over $500 from a joint account without checking with the other spouse. And
have you adjusted that for inflation?
Yeah. What's funny is I think we actually go lower because it's become such a habit for us. Even if it's, $200, it's, hey, babe, I'm at the store. I'm about to get this thing. Just want to let you know.
Wow.
And what I've found is when I've suggested this to clients is every couple has a number. Every couple, even
you spend what?
Right.
Could be $250, could be $250,000. Yeah.
Right. Even the the last professional athlete that we represented said anything under 10,000, you can just go ahead and spend it. I don't need to know about it. But over 10,000,
I want to know.
I want to know. Yeah. And so, if you build in kind of this transparency and communication in your finances, one, it can bleed over into the rest of your relationship. But two, you build this habit of, for retirement planning, we're going to talk about these things. We've got it regular. We've got a repeating event on our calendar, on our shared calendar that says, every December 1, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about what our retirement contribution is going to look like for the upcoming year.
And then the upcoming holidays. What are we spending?
The upcoming holidays, right.
Aaron, what if you want to buy a present that's above $500 for your wife?
I get that from my own bucket. Right. So.
That's right. You said joint account.
Right.
Anything is $500 from the joint account. But if you're going to spend $1,000 and you don't want her to know about it because it's a gift, that comes from your particular bucket, which is right.
Yeah. And I think that these money buckets, as I like to call them, are just as crucial of a component of kind of the healthy financial relationship.
All right. So I get this question a lot. I would say that what I typically see is the fully joined one joint account. Mm-hmm. Now the percentage goes down that's the primary mode of operation in a second marriage. that it's usually my account, your account, and then our account. But this is your first marriage, so what? I'm assuming that it is because you have such good marital skills, you're going to probably never get divorced with your check-in ability. This is awesome. But what if you were to, in your opinion, what is the correct marital combo? I get this question a lot.
Yeah.
Should we each have our own accounts and then a joint account, or just one account? But if it's not just one account, then we're not really together. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, the problem that I see is couples do one of two things often. One, we follow our parents' formula, which is one account, right? Because it wasn't as easy to have, just open up a digital account, on your phone through an app, one account, everything goes in and comes out of that account. But the problem with that is it leads to a lot of argument over spending, especially if you got one spouse who's a spender and the other one who's a saver. What I found that works best is to have the 3 accounts set up where you've got mine, yours, and ours. And the variations of that are what I call the inside out, which is the money goes into the joint account and then some kind of allowance, if you will, flows out of that account into the separate accounts. Or you do an outside in plan where the money goes into your separate accounts and then flows into the joint account to pay for those joint bills. I find that the couples who would normally, left to their own devices, just have one account, probably the inside out plan, the money going into that joint account first and it being all visible and then each spouse getting their spending money from that works better. And for couples who are older and used to being on their own and used to managing their own money for the past 20 years, and the idea
second marriage,
right, second marriage, that outside in plan is going to work better. But either way, it reduces kind of arguments over discretionary spending when you have your own spending money. So for example, I got to get the new phone every year when it comes out.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I don't even know I don't even know what it does.
But you like getting the latest iPhone.
I got to have the latest iPhone every year when it comes out. My wife would never spend money on that.
She's still on the iPhone 5.
Right. Yeah. She gets whatever one that I'm done with. Right. And so, she saw that $1,200 coming out of the joint account every year. I'm sure she might feel some kind of way about it. Now, on the other hand, I'm a brown bagger for lunch. And she likes to go out and get lunch with her colleagues and, her employees and that kind of thing. And if I saw that $20 coming out, of the joint account every day for lunch when I'm, making my peanut butter and jelly sandwich at home, I might feel some kind, and we could be spending the exact same amount of money total on our discretionary spending every year, but our own spending is invisible to us. And our spouse's spending is glaring when we come out of the joint account.
Yeah, it's the cross justification, right? It's the and I think about we really are judgy about our spending because whatever we're spending money on, it's totally justified. With whatever somebody else. So you're spending $50,000. Well, how would you spend $100,000 on our car? Why would you do that, right? I drive a old pickup truck. Well, the guy with the old pickup truck has a $100,000 horse that's super expensive to feed and take care of. But the guy with the $100,000 car says, why would you ever spend $100,000 on a horse when you? So we all have our own version of what's appropriate.
Right. When what's probably more important is the amount, right? So if I don't see my wife spending because she does it from her account. She doesn't see my spending. And if there's ever a debate, a common phrase in our house was, I'll just get it from my money. Because then that ends the debate because we have already agreed a certain amount of our joint money is going to retirement. Some is going to savings. Our big extravagance is our travel. So we have a travel fund. We have an agreement that, 5% of all the money that comes in the household is automatically going to travel.
Oh, I like that idea of budgeting a percentage towards something. That's cool. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody do that. That's a great idea. 5%. Just go. Now, do you have a separate account for travel or do you just keep it all? It's still within one.
It's within the same account, but we kind of have, we'll switch it over to, the brokerage, and keep it in cash, so that it's there.
I love that idea. I love that idea.
And that way, the money that comes into our separate accounts, we can spend guilt-free without any ounce of oversight. And we get to maintain the autonomy that we had before we got married without jeopardizing the big, retirement goals that we have set together.
And do you have a certain set amount that goes out each month to each separate individual account? Is that how you guys do it?
Yeah, we get equal allowances.
What happens if you have one spouse doesn't work, though? What kind of scenario do you like for that?
Yeah, we'll still do the 3 accounts.
All right, so let's say husband doesn't work, wife works, brings in all the money. What do you do? How much goes into the husband's account? How would you do that? Would you do the inside out where you go into the joint account first and then both get a certain amount each month?
Yeah. I mean, I think either one can work as long as the numbers make sense. Kind of the one big overarching goal is you can't have two spouses living in the same household, but in different socioeconomic classes. Right.
Ooh.
That tends not to work.
Yeah, right.
Right. But if you,
I can do the $250 lunch or dinner, but you're brown bagging.
Right. But you're brown bagging.
Because I make the money and you don't.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
That's a recipe for disaster, I think. But if you, and a lot of couples will do this. They'll set things up where they say, okay, each of us will contribute, 30% of our take-home income to the joint account to pay the bills. And so if one spouse isn't working, 30% of zero is zero. And the other spouse pays, their share, but they each get their own amount of spending money every month
from that joint account.
So that the spouse who isn't working, and usually it's for some kind of agreed upon purpose, raising children or homemaking, or maybe one person has to cater for the other person's career and that person has to travel, or whatever it is.
Still has a similar amount of money. So you don't
still
have two
has a similar amount of money.
In
so
the same house.
You don't have two classes, and you don't set up this kind of unhealthy financial power dynamic in the household where one spouse is having to come and, can I get some more spending money today? I kind of ran out and I'm tired of peanut butter and jelly. No, you want to have access to money to spend however you want for both spouses.
Fascinating. There's a lot more to prenups than just what you see in the tabloids.
There is.
It's really a healthy mechanism. And not only is the document a healthy mechanism, the process of doing it is healthy and transparent. And then the framework, or almost the blueprint of the prenup, sets you on on an interestingly transparent financial path that is repeatable. And this is probably why, some of our research, we studied the financial habits of happy versus unhappy retirees. One of the financial habits of happy versus unhappy, they spend more time. The happy group spends more time discussing their finances. So they spend on average a few hours every month talking about their money in a healthy way. So it makes sense. The prenup is really supporting that, or this framework, this structure.
Yeah, absolutely. If nothing else, it forces what I think for a lot of couples, a conversation that otherwise would never happen, right? Because most of the time when we prepare the prenup and we ensure that this disclosure of assets and debts has happened by literally creating a schedule, a sheet of paper, kind of a net worth statement for each spouse. And a lot of times, this is the first time that each spouse has seen their significant other's net worth in black and white. They may have spoken vaguely about it, but that they see it in black and white on a piece of paper because, let's be honest, one, talking about money is taboo altogether in our society, and it's not something that we learned in school or necessarily.
It's not the most fun topic.
It's not the most fun topic. It's not first date material, certainly, and it's probably not third or fifth date material. You're trying to show your best to the person that you're trying to woo while you're dating them, and what happens is there's never a good time to kind of get naked with your finances with your spouse, and you end up just pushing it to the back burner, and it never comes up by forcing this conversation to happen and literally seeing it on the black and white. Okay, now we've seen everything there is. No shame, no judgment. We're going in completely open, and we set this pattern. All right, we're going to sit down, at least every year, but for some couples it's biannually or quarterly, maybe monthly, and we're going to have this conversation about the finances. We're both going to be involved in it. It sets the couple on an even playing field. Like I said, it kind of builds in that habit of transparency from the very beginning.
I want to talk about post-nups. I want to ask you about a post-nuptial in just a second, but just going back to clarity, you're saying there's the four categories. You've got the money, essentially, the distribution of the money, the alimony, custody, child support. You can't do anything about child support or custody within a prenup, correct?
Yes, not directly.
Not directly. Alimony, though, is a discretionary amount that you can set in the prenup, or a judge can say, this is how much you're going to pay in alimony to one of the spouses. Is that correct?
Correct.
Child support, though, again, just for our audience listening, is this in Georgia and in most states, that's just formulaic. Is that typically just a formula of whatever your income is, or just really a state set amount per child? Well, how does that work typically?
Yeah, it's mostly formulaic. So I'll use Georgia as an example.
Yeah.
You put in one parent's income, you put in the other parent's income, you drop in the health insurance premium, and it spits out a number that is kind of the basic child support obligation. However, wish it were that simple, but you can always argue for higher or lower based on the particular needs of your child, or whether they should go to private school or public school, or how much their extracurriculars are, or what's, kind of a standard based on your income level. So
the child support doesn't stay that formulaic number, and then the alimony makes up for it. You actually would adjust in a divorce child support.
Yeah, alimony is a completely separate number, and I would say calculation, but Georgia doesn't actually use a calculator to figure out.
Well, this is just the judge, right? Wind in the air. It's like finger up, up.
Yeah, the statute is
it really
so
that
vague.
Is it that is it that willy nilly?
The factors. There's two factors in the statute.
What are the alimony factors?
The higher earning spouse's ability to pay, and the lower earning spouse's need to receive. And you can see how subjective those items would be. So you can have a situation where you walk into one courtroom in the courthouse, and the judge says, "Oh yeah, this is worth $5,000 a month for 5 years alimony." And you walk into the very next courtroom down the hallway, and the judge says, "Nope. That spouse, he's got a degree, he's got the ability to work, he can get out there and make his own money, zero alimony."
Wow, the judges have so much power,
absolute discretion when it comes to alimony. And so what a lot of couples,
think though that a judge that, and again, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but judges in general, they're typically fair people to become a judge, right? I mean, so is there a big variation? I guess you did say there is.
There is
they're
a
just
variation.
They're humans, right?
I mean, they're humans, and people come from different backgrounds, and people have kind of their own ideas about what is worth what in a relationship. Some judges are going to devalue kind of the unpaid work of the homemaker,
and some might
and
support
others and others are going to support it. And a lot of times you don't know who you're getting. Like I said, it's a random assignment of who your case gets assigned to. So, a lot of couples prefer to take that decision out of this crazy uncertainty whirlpool that could be a future judge down the line and say, all right, let's come up with the scenarios under which we think alimony would be appropriate. So, and
then here's how much we think would be appropriate. And you would do that as a percentage or a dollar amount.
A lot of times we'll do a formula, right? So if you have been out of the workforce for 3 years because you're home taking care of our kids, then we're going to agree that for every 2 months that you've been out of work, you're going to get 1 month of alimony. Or for every 3 months that you've been out of work, you're going to go, 1 month of alimony. And the amount of alimony is going to be, say, 15% or 20% of the differential in our gross incomes at the time.
And that's the formula.
That happens, right? And so you can come with a formula, and you can create scenarios where it doesn't come into play, or requirements that you got to get back to work after a certain amount of time. But you can come up with your own way to avoid leaving the question of alimony completely up in the air.
All right, let's say I get married. I'm 20. I get married. I could barely make the high school basketball team, and my spouse and I were both 20. But for some miracle of what will eventually be a Disney movie, I make it to the NBA by age 25. And now I go from nothing for the first X amount of years to making $10 million a year. Is that when you're getting a prenup? Or I'm sorry, is that when you're getting a postnup? Or maybe what's a more realistic scenario?
Yeah. So the most common scenario is when somebody gets a postnup. So one is we wanted to get a prenup and we didn't plan our time correctly. And so we're getting a prenup but late. So it's technically a postnup. And the other, probably most common, is when the couple has reached some point of difficulty. Right. And either the marriage is on the rocks and, one spouse wants to save the relationship, and they say, okay, we'll work on the relationship, but you're going to agree that, here are going to be the rules of the road. And if things don't work out, I want to be taken care of, or we're going to split these assets, equally. Or they could be on the rocks and know that the possibility of a messy divorce is coming down the pike. And while we are still on decent terms, let's go ahead and set these rights and responsibilities, in writing right now. Or it could be something, a little more benign than that. Look, for example, a very common thing that we see today is a couple gets married and one spouse already owns a home and the other spouse is moving into that home. And at some point, they're married for a couple of years and they're splitting, the bills. And at some point, the spouse that moves in says, all right, this house, the deed is in your name only. The mortgage is in your name only, and I am Venmoing you half of the mortgage every month. Am I gaining equity in this home? Or is this your home and I'm paying rent to you and you're just getting rich off of my rent?
This is second class.
Right.
Two systems here, two class systems now.
Right, of ownership in the house that you happen to be living in. Is this our house? Are you going to put me on the deed? And so sometimes we'll figure out a way to, give the spouse who already owned the house some credit for the equity that they had coming into the marriage while dividing the equity that they amassed over the course of the marriage. And couples will do that different ways. Sometimes we'll use a formula. Sometimes we'll say, all right, you take the first $200,000 off the top and everything else is going to be, considered 50-50. But a lot of times people need clarity on that. And it may not even just be for the finances. It may be, I moved into your house, so do I have a say on this renovation that we're planning? Do I get to paint a room, or is this really your house that I'm living in, even though we're a married couple?
Are these are tougher conversations, though, it sounds like. Post-nuptials don't sound easy.
They can often be tougher because a lot of times they're arising because a problem is already surfaced.
Already there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see even on our best day of marital bliss, if I would go to Lynn with this, this would not be a good conversation. I'm sorry, you didn't want to do what? A what? So it seems like, but again, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to create a less messy exit. And is there any, to do a post-nup, and is there any, I guess, the counter spouse that doesn't want to do it, I guess in the end, if somebody doesn't want to do it, it's not going to get done. You can't do a one-sided post-nup.
You can't do a one-sided post-nup, no. But I think, what's important, if somebody is interested in doing a post-nup and they think that their spouse is going to be hesitant, is to think about the benefits to the other. If it's one-sided, why would he or she ever sign it? If it's just going to protect the assets that you think need protecting that are on your side of the column, why would they ever do it? But if you're saying, hey, look, we're going to treat each other fairly and we're going to split everything 50-50, and I just want to go ahead and put that down in writing so that we don't end up in a situation where, we're pointing fingers or slinging mud to try to get to 60% instead of 50%. Or you say, hey, I want to recognize the contributions you have made to this relationship that may not be purely financial. And so, let's go ahead and determine, alimony on our own. Or it could just be, let's get clear about who owns what. We've got all these different accounts, but you ask the average person on the street who's married, and they have no idea what they would walk away with were their relationship to come to an end.
You make these difficult conversations sound so palatable. Maybe that's a gift you have, Aaron. Like, oh yeah, you would say it this way. Would you like to be transparent about our finances? Sure, of course you would. As we kind of wrap here, so we talked about the cost. It could be, you said it could be a few $1,000s. It could be maybe 10 or 15 if it's more complicated. Yeah.
For most couples, it's going to be, around that few grand dollar amount, depending obviously on your location and the lawyer that you choose to go with.
And again, first and second marriages, you would still recommend a prenup for any multiple of marriages. You would say still a good idea to do, correct?
Still a good idea to do.
And never not a good idea to do a prenup? There's no scenarios where it's not a good idea.
To me, it is one, it is clarity. It is building in transparency and communication requirements into your relationship. So even if, for those couples who say, I'm never going to get divorced, there actually are benefits to your marriage, to, kind of having things down on paper. But I also, having, been the representation in over 1,000 divorces now, would not wish the contested divorce process on my worst enemy.
Contested divorce is just brutal.
If nothing else, the conversation about like what would be fair if, we don't ever want it to happen, but it's kind of like life insurance. You want to have it in place. You hope you never need it.
What do people find at prenups.com? What are you helping people do there? And is it formulaic and it's already there, or is it something where you are helping each person that gets one of these? Or is it self-contained?
No, it is You can schedule a consultation. We've got a free ebook that lays out, I think, kind of like the 7 top tips for planning for a successful financial marriage. And we're in the process of putting up a free video course so that couples can learn how to join their finances when they're getting married. Got plenty of videos and blog posts and tons of resources and information for people at prenups.com.
Again, fascinating topic. Again, I think we clearly have the preconceived notion that prenups are uncomfortable and they're usually messy and it's the last thing you want to do. But I think I've walked away from this thinking it's really, why wouldn't everybody just do this? It's structure and it's transparency, and that's almost always, to your point, it's almost always a great thing for a couple and their finances, particularly for our audience who's thinking about this retire sooner journey. So Aaron, thank you, my friend, so much for being here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been an honor.